Hello and welcome. I am David Callahan with the Prince Mohammad bin Fahd Program for Strategic Research and Studies, and I'm here with Michael Carroll of the Hollings Center. Michael Carroll has served as the Executive Director of the Istanbul and DC-based Hollings Center, which facilitates dialogue on a range of issues between the United States and the Islamic world since 2013. He previously served as the inaugural Assistant Director for the Institute for the Study of Muslim Societies and Civilizations at Boston University. He has also served as the Executive Director of the American Institute of Afghanistan Studies and the American Institute for Yemeni Studies. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks for having me.
So, what is the Hollings Center's mission?
So the Hollings Center was created by an act of Congress in 2003 to foster dialogue between the United States and Muslim-majority nations. It was a thankfully broad mission, which is both a blessing and a curse, in that gives us a lot of flexibility to discuss different issues of importance between both peoples. But at the same time, it requires us to try to understand and do underserved topics that are not part of the crises du jour, that are not part of the usual dialogue process. Over that time, since our first dialogue program in 2005, we've hosted over 40 dialogue programs, had about 1,000 participants from over 40 countries throughout the world to discuss many different issues, ranging from simple bilateral discussions between the U.S. and a particular nation, regional policy discussions, resource resiliency and environmental issues, education, human security issues, among many others.
What are some of the education examples that you mentioned previously?
So we've done quite a few of those different types of dialogues, and some of them were more broad in focus. One of our earlier dialogues was on quality assurances in higher education institutions in different countries in the world. But we also have done some that are much more specified in nature. In 2014, we had a dialogue on improving Libyan higher education, which was something following the ouster of Gaddafi, was something that was in desperate need, I think, in different parts of Libya. We've also had education dialogues that have tied to different sectors and topics that we have done in other dialogues. In 2015, we hosted a dialogue that explored the connections between education and the economy in a lot of these areas, and the interrelationship between the two being a necessary policy decision in the cases of many countries, including our own. So these have ranged, our education dialogues have ranged in topic from very academic discussions on pedagogy all the way to macroeconomic and political types of discussions.
One of the specific areas within your biography and kind of with the Hollings Center has been Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. What are some of the issues that are facing Afghanistan presently?
So Afghanistan has been one of our primary niche topics that we've conducted since our beginning. Our first dialogue program, in fact, was in 2005, and it was on the issues between Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's not ironic to say that our next dialogue program is also going to be on issues between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So it's interesting to see things come full circle, but at the same time, I think it highlights the importance of sustained dialogue on these particular subject matters. The issues between Afghanistan and Pakistan, while changed somewhat in the ensuing 13 years, it's still a very important both international and regional discussion that needs to be had. Other things we've covered in Afghanistan has tried to look beyond just the AFPAC relationship. We've had a dialogue program that looked at the rule of law in Afghanistan, for example. Another one that looked at Afghanistan's other neighbors, which includes Iran, some of the Central Asian states, and even China. And we've tried to look at, sticking points like the Durand Line. The Durand Line, for those who don't know, is the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan that was set by the British in the late 19th century, which continues to be a major sticking point, both in interpersonal relationships, but also between the two governments, even to this day, to the point where I'm even starting to think, is it an excuse? So we try to have those discussions, not just on those sticking points, but on some of the long-ranging necessities that a better relationship, that Afghanistan and Pakistan need to have, but also that the relationship is not just Afghanistan and Pakistan when it comes to the Afghans. They have other neighbors, they have other needs, both internally and externally.
Afghanistan has been referred to as the graveyard of empires. Do you feel like it's also becoming the graveyard of dialogues, or has there been much progress in the sort of results of your dialogues about it?
It's definitely not a dead discussion whenever we have an Afghanistan dialogue. I think there has been some progress in some of the secondary programs that we tie to a lot of our primary dialogue programs. The Hollings Center runs a small grants program that gives an opportunity to participants of dialogues to engage in exchanges, to host workshops, to conduct further dialogue programs within the country. And we've had quite a few that have actually gone to Afghanistan-related work, including some that looked at cultural heritage preservation, others that looked at educational resources, and even some that looked at, a recent one that looked at the Special Immigrant Visa Program, which is a program that the United States created for Afghan nationals that helped us during the conflict in Afghanistan, when we were involved in the conflict in Afghanistan. We look at a lot of those issues, and it may seem sometimes when you're sitting in these discussions that, wait, that sounds very similar to what I was hearing in 2005 or 2006 or 2007. And that may be true, and you may not feel like you're moving the needle, but you'd actually be surprised to know that the needle has moved a little bit. And in some cases, we think that while the dialogue program may not create the policy that changes everything, it does create interpersonal relationships that can have that kind of effect down the line. Some of the earlier participants in our Afghanistan dialogues at the beginning are now in higher positions in both the Afghan and Pakistani governments. And as a result of that, you can have these moments where they reflect very positively on their experience in Istanbul. And in times where the governments may not be talking to each other, you might have an open line of communication based on that interpersonal relationship that spawned off from what is essentially a small meeting in a third country. So tracing that kind of effect is one of the more difficult things we do. It's not the easiest thing to trace. It's not always quantifiable. And it doesn't have the immediacy that I think a lot of people demand for in this day and age, but you do see it. And that's why we continue to sustain those types of programs in the long term over our history, is because you can create those interpersonal relationships that actually could mean something down the line.
So kind of on the same terms, that has the sort of goal of the Hollings Center, since it's so long form, has that made it harder to operate, harder to see progress, see success?
Certainly. Yeah, I mean, we're only now beginning to see some of the medium-term effects of, maybe our first 10 dialogue programs. We're living in an age now where there's a need for immediacy, whether it's immediate gratification or immediate proof of impact or numbers and quantifiable. And to go back to like the education dialogues, the analogy I use, probably overuse, is education is the silver bullet. It just takes 25 years to hit its target. And nobody has the patience for something that's going to take 25 years when you're surrounded by crises du jour. And when you're living in an age of immediate gratification on social media, or when your funder or somebody who's giving you a grant wants to see an immediate impact. And so it is challenging to run these types of programs in this type of day and age because it's not going to be an immediate effect. It could be 30 years before you have that spark moment where something that you had done had actually led to a policy change or led to a major decision or fostered a particular bit of research or a new idea. But that's why we persist in doing it, because there is evidence to suggest that sustained over long term, you can have those kinds of movements. And that's why we'll continue to do. We continue to look at these dialogues and their themes not just as one-off dialogues, but rather long-term initiatives. And that can be hard to justify, but the reward, if successful, is quite high.
You mentioned previously cultural preservation. How has the Hollings Center been sort of approaching the issue of groups like ISIS dismantling monuments, historical archaeological sites in Iraq and Syria?
So a funny story behind that. In 2014, a board member who is an archaeologist by trade introduced me to some individuals that were working at the University of Pennsylvania on cultural heritage preservation in, particularly in the Euphrates River Valley. And the conflict in Syria and Iraq, even before ISIS, was putting a lot of these sites, not just archaeological, but also museums and places where some of these priceless artifacts are being kept, under threat. And, this was, I think, in the fall of 2014, and at that point I committed the organization to having a dialogue to look at this very issue. And funnily enough, in that time in 2014, nobody cared. And sure enough, just a few months later in January 2015, my phone was ringing off the hook asking, could we do the meeting in the next 2 weeks? Because you had incidents like, Palmyra, and you started to see signs of intentional destruction, and where the intentional destruction of these various sites was being used as propaganda tools by militant groups in the region. And so we hosted a dialogue program to look at, issues of emergency preparedness, try to take stock about what had happened and what is still happening and what might happen going forward. And it was certainly a contentious dialogue. There are a lot of sensitivities when it comes to cultural heritage. A lot of different mindsets about how things should be done, not just during conflict, but before and after it as well. And who should be involved? Is it, from people on the ground who are, risking their lives to document what's there, but not only that, the destruction as well, all the way up to international organizations that are trying to create at least a communal global effort to try to help this issue. So it was a contentious dialogue, but what came out of it was, again, through a small grants program that the Hollings Center conducts. We had one applicant who applied to us to do a workshop that involved cultural heritage preservationists and workers in northern Iraq together to talk about emergency preparedness, to look at what are you going to do if you only have 36 hours before militants are in the area. What are you going to save? What do you need to do to prepare a site? What do you need to do after the militants leave? And things like that. And it's a very important and contentious issue. Many people forget that in addition to selling oil on the black market, ISIS was also selling artifacts on the black market to fund their operations. So it's not just an importance in terms of cultural heritage, it's also important in terms of security.
So you mentioned various sensitivities and issues. What have been some of the biggest problems when it comes to doing these dialogues?
We're living in an age now where doing these types of programs is becoming increasingly more difficult. You have a scenario, particularly in the MENA region right now, where various proxy conflicts, whether it be Syria or Yemen, or the dispute between the GCC and Qatar, disputes, alliances between Turkey and Iran, or Iran, the Sunni-Shia divide, where it is becoming increasingly harder to do these types of programs. Now, how do these conflicts affect, a small dialogue program of 25 people? Well, for one, visa regimes throughout the entire region are getting a lot stricter. Inviting an Egyptian male who's of a certain age is actually quite difficult. It's hard for, I think it's like 19 to 35 or something like that in age to actually get an exit visa to leave Egypt to attend some of these meetings. Additionally, when we can get visas or we don't have visas denied and we can get people, to these meetings, there's been a noticeable uptick in my mind of self-censorship, particularly the concern that by attending these meetings that what is being said could ultimately negatively impact them when they return home. You hear a lot more talking points than you used to, which is frustrating, but it can be, if you can get around them, you could still have a meaningful dialogue. And there's also, I think, there's some concern, we're an American organization that's trying to foster dialogue. There is sometimes a fear of guilt by association, where if they attend a dialogue program that is essentially being hosted by Americans, this is going to negatively impact them. So finding participants, getting them visas, finding locations in which to meet where open discussion can be had has been more of a challenge in the last few years than it was probably at the beginning of this organization. We've tried to come up with new strategies to find our ways around it. We've changed topics, we've broadened scope, we've moved locations. We have played visa hopscotch, I think, a few times, trying to find the right localities for certain national groups to be able to attend. But it's been a challenge. I do think this unsettled period will come to an end at some point. What it'll look like at the other end of it, I'm not sure at this point. But we'll continue to try to adopt different strategies that will allow us to continue to have this meaningful and important work done so we can actually address some of these issues rather than listen to talking points or being closed-lipped.
Most people commonly know of issues in Syria and Yemen as mainly just the civil war. What are some localized issues or localized applications of regional issues in those two countries that people might not know about?
I guess I'll begin talking a little bit about the case in Yemen. And so some of the more recent dialogues we have done have looked at the regional issues of water, energy, and food in the MENA region, their interconnectedness, as well as the impact that stressors on any one of those three can actually have on other elements within the region. And Yemen is an excellent case of how things can spiral out of control if you don't have good policies, if you don't manage the resiliency of these resources. So take a look at Yemen. Yemen has only been unified since 1990, and so it has always had internal divisions, whether they're tribal or, if you were part of the former communist government or, part of the other. There have always been these internal divisions, and so it was always a kind of loosely held together confederation at best to begin with. And I think one of the participants at one of our first dialogues in this was saying close to 90% of the remaining groundwater was being used for the cultivation of khat, which is a leaf that when you chew on it, it has like a narcotic effect. Not all that dissimilar from like tobacco or something like that, but 90% of the groundwater was being used by this. And particularly in the 1960s and 70s, this groundwater was being pumped out by diesel pumps, which are now making a lot of those aquifers run dry. Sana'a ran dry, I think it was a couple of years ago, or it's really dangerously close to running dry, and Aden's not that far behind, and you have this completely inexplicable production of a plant that provides no nutritional value, using up most of the groundwater resources. Then you had protests. Then you had civil conflict. And now that civil conflict has evolved into a regional proxy conflict. Other actors in the region involved, which resulted in food and fuel shipments being suppressed, which is only exacerbating the situation even further because now they can't pump the water because they don't have the diesel to pump the water in some cases. And you're looking at the possibility of a systemic collapse. And that's just one example. And that's the less discussed one. I mean, Syria is obviously another example of where you had a drought that started in 2005. Whether that drought precipitated the conflict, there's debate about that. But you can't argue that didn't create internal migration, more into the cities, exacerbated existing tensions, and then you had the spark that was 2011. And so discussing issues like water, energy, and food on a regional level is important. One, because it's one of the few things that I think some of these states are still willing to cooperate on in some cases. And then at the same time, it's an issue that's not going to go away. And the longer these conflicts persist, the worse it's going to get. So that's why we want to continue to do those types of discussions, because they will exist long after the conflicts end. And the potential for exacerbating the effects of those conflicts if these issues aren't addressed is very important.
Recently, South Africa had the issue of almost running out of water. The rain came right as the day happened, they run out. How has the Hollings Center been incorporating maybe people not specifically in the region but have similar issues such as food, water, energy?
Mm-hmm. South Africa, I think, is another example of a nation that can benefit from the experiences that are going on in other nations. And when we have these discussions on resource resiliency, while each situation within a country is different, there are different political situations, there's different governance issues, there's different sources, different levels of production, different technologies being applied. There is a kind of shared concern that I think a lot of countries actually have when it comes to these issues. You look at water alone. You're in Florida. Most people think that Florida must be okay on water. Florida actually has a water crisis. It's not, you'll occasionally see on the news a sinkhole popped open in Orlando, and that's because groundwater is being pumped out at such a high rate, and these aquifers are not recharging. You have situations in the Colorado River Basin that are not all that dissimilar to what's happening in the Tigris and Euphrates River Basin in the Middle East, or in some of the Central Asian river basins where Soviet-era damming has resulted in very bad water management techniques. So there is, I think, a shared, not just a shared concern, but also shared knowledge of resources about not just how to do things, but how not to do things. That there is downsides to damming. There is disputes over water that can be resolved. It's actually remarkable how we actually had plenty of examples in the water dialogue about how water can actually be a conflict resolver, not a conflict creator. You see that within states here in the United States. Thankfully, at least in this case, you have a federal government that can adjudicate and be the final word, where you don't necessarily have that in Turkey, Iraq, and Syria, or between Iran and Afghanistan. So that's another thing where the dialogue process can be very useful. In the absence of said mediators or adjudicators or final decisions, you can have a process that opens up channels of discussion that can help resolve disputes. We weren't involved in this one, but there was a dispute resolution between the Sudan and Egypt on the Nile. There was a water compact between Turkey, Iraq, and Syria before the recent conflicts broke out. There can be movement on some of these issues. And rather than touch the hot button security issue at the time, sometimes it's easier to actually have the discussion on issues like this. Doesn't mean it doesn't get contentious, because it certainly does. The discussion on food security was particularly sensitive, to my surprise. But there can be movement on these things.
One last question. With the Hollings Center's use of long-term goals, what are some things that the Hollings Center has their eyes out for or hoping to address in the future?
That's a good question. We've always tried to be ahead of the curve, forward-thinking when it came to a lot of our discussions, not just so that underserved topics can be addressed, but rather we can understand the challenges that may be coming. The cultural heritage was a good example of us being ahead of the curve. Some of the ones that we have coming up, in particular, the one I want to mention is we're going to have a discussion on healthcare. And that is, I think, a major challenge in the MENA region, but also here in the U.S. and globally, that needs to be discussed. In the MENA region, you have entire countries that are probably going to be going through a collective post-traumatic stress response, looking at Syria, Lebanon, Jordan. You have these oddly conflicting realities of malnutrition and obesity happening at the same time within short distances from each other. And there are multiple health effects that come for that kind of thing. We have not just malnutrition, but heart disease is up, obesity is up. And how these nations can start developing health policies and healthcare systems that can address those kinds of needs is going to be very important. And I think there needs to be almost kind of a collective thinking too of how can we leapfrog systems that already exist in westernized countries that may not work in the MENA region, that may be too 20th century. And so these are some of the issues we want to discuss. And it's a very big pot of topics to discuss in the healthcare spectrum. But that's something we want to look at because it's going to be an increasing importance, not just this year, but 10 years, 20, 30 years from now, that the development of better health care and better health policy is going to be critically important. And it's linked into almost a lot of the other topics that we've discussed, water, energy, and food. Health is a big important component of that. Economy. You got to have a healthy workforce. You got to, they're all interlinked. So we want to start talking about that side of the discussion. The other topic that we see coming up is one that we've addressed previously in other dialogues, but I think requires sustained discussion, and that's the issue of public perceptions. We're living in an age now where there's a lot of noise, that there seems, in my opinion, almost a communications breakdown, I think, on a whole host of levels. And public perceptions have probably shifted. And public perceptions turn into real policy, whether it's a public perception held by the general populace or a perception held by a government or a leader. It can have a dramatic effect on real livelihoods. And that's true of the case when the MENA region looks at the United States. There is definitely going to be, or if there hasn't been already, a major shift in public perception there. What is that going to do for the relationships going in the next 5, 10, 20 years? How do we anticipate those public perceptions shifting? How is that affecting policy? What can be done to better manage public perceptions? Not that you want to control a person's public perception, but how do you avoid misperception? How do you have the discussion that makes it clear that that's not what we're going for, or that's not what our intent is, or our intent is this? I think it's going to be a very important discussion that needs to be held among many countries going forward so that we can break through some of the noise and try to deal with realities and facts rather than beliefs or conspiracies. And so that'll be an interesting one, I think, too. These are the two subjects that I think we'll be addressing in the next 6 months to a year. And we'll see what kind of movement we can get on that, and whether these initial forays into these two subject matters, healthcare and public perceptions, will yield further dialogue.
Great to hear. Thank you for coming out, Michael Carroll.
Thank you. It was great to be here.